It was certainly worth a shot anyway. Okay, General, I'm sending orders to the killers now. Light speed delay will add to the total turnaround time. I think we're looking at 22 hours before they get back. Richards frowned. Hell, we could get a couple of drones there in less time than that. To do what? Even at full acceleration, they're unlikely to do much damage. I was thinking more along the lines of grabbing Medeiros himself. I stared at Richards. That hadn't occurred to me. Stick some roamers in the drone's holds, and they could enter the Brazilian ship and extract the replicant matrix. I felt a twinge of nausea at what we were not quite planning. Memories of Homer, of the 5 cubes back on Earth during Bob 1's training, swirled with images from my imagination of Mac under Medeiros' thumb. But we were dealing with someone who was about to drop a metal meteor on a colony. Squeamishness was inappropriate. The drones approached the Brazilian ship, which was still drifting. We decided this was important enough to sacrifice all of Asgard's roamers, save 2 for rebuilding. This would be almost like a beach assault. Anything short of 100% casualties would be acceptable. The 2 drones came in as quickly as their drives could manage, braking with no leeway to arrive at rest just outside the rent in the enemy vessel. Cargo doors popped open and 8 roamers, including 2 of the big industrial-size units, stormed across the gap. The squad headed straight for the location of the replicant matrix. We knew the layout from Bob 1's first encounter with Medeiros, way back in Epsilon Eridani. The roamers encountered immediate resistance from the on-board roamers. The battle was short and furious. Medeiros was fighting for his life now. The standard roamers worked to protect the big units, as those would be needed for moving the matrix. Plasma cutters flashed, and roamer parts floated around the enclosed space. The battle tilted in our direction once we realized that we could still use the big units. Anytime an enemy roamer got too close, an industrial unit lashed out with a leg. If the impact didn't disarticulate the victim outright, being bounced off a wall took it out of the fight for a few moments. Soon, we were down to 1 or 2 defenders, depending on how you counted body parts. Then the last roamer was dispatched, and "What the hell?" I exclaimed as all video feeds disappeared. Garfield poked at consoles. "The cargo drones are gone too. Wait a moment, that's not true. I'm still getting telemetry from number 2. I'll try to activate a camera." Richards jerked in surprise in his video window as the event registered at the human timescale. "What happened?" "Looks like Medeiros fell on his sword rather than be captured," Garfield said. He popped up a video window. "This is what the second drone is showing. It's damaged, by the way. Won't be flying back on its own." The window showed the Brazilian vessel, or what was left of it. Pieces of spaceship spun and caught the sunlight as they receded. The ship was cut in 2, and the 2 halves had been opened like flowers. "He knew," I said. "He knew he was finished. I don't know if he thought he was taking the victory away from us or thought we'd capture him and extract secrets." I shook my head. "I will never understand Medeiros. I really hope this is the last time I have to deal with him." "That's a little worrying, though," Garfield commented. "I remember him being a bit on the pompous side at the first meeting with Bob 1. This time around he never said a word, not even an exit monologue. I wonder what secrets he might feel the need to take to the grave." An excellent question, and the expression on Richards's and Kuroshi's faces showed the same concern that I felt. "Never even saw him coming," Max said. He sat in my VR holding a coffee, feet up on a footstool. "I remember talking to you about draining the swamps on Takama, and the next thing I know, I'm back in my default VR." "Yep, he hit you square on." I raised my coffee. "You can go over the videos at your leisure, but you missed some interesting times." "Which aren't over, I'm afraid." Mac looked at his coffee, a frown forming. "We have to assume Medeiros is still out there, in one form or another. We'll have to set up defenses, especially here and in Alpha Centauri." "That's right, buddy. The colonies are okay with you diverting all printers to defensive items until you have a minimum level of ordnance." "Yep. Busters. Then a new vessel. Then some clones, then more printers. It'll be a while before I'm able to support the colonies directly." "They'll do what they can with groundside printers, Mac. Might be a good idea for them to have at least a small auto factory on each planet, just on principle. Mac nodded, staring into space. Just when we think we've got things figured out, the universe throws another curve. I grinned at him. Well, that's life. 31. Cleanup. Marcus, September 2215, Poseidon. The loss of their main fleet was a blow to the Council, but not a fatal one, as it turned out. Maybe I'd been underestimating the Council. Or maybe they had someone who was a terrific strategist. Whatever the reason, the Council kept coming up with surprises. The first surprise, although I suspected as much, was that they didn't have just the dozen cargo ships. Our first inkling of that came the day after our takeover of strategic ground assets. We've got several cities under attack, Gina announced, sitting up abruptly. Cal opened one eye. He was lying on a blanket getting some sun, and said, With what? See for yourselves. Gina held her tablet up. On it was shown a grainy, obviously blown-up image of a vessel. It appeared to my eye to be a variation on a version 3 Heaven vessel. Interesting. Looks like they've been reading BobNet, I said. I don't know why that didn't occur to me. I wouldn't normally think of it as strategic information. And yet the improvements the Bobs have been making in the Heaven design have been primarily for military purposes, Cal responded. Plus, Dinu added, if they've been perusing BobNet, wouldn't they have found out about the cloaking? I raised an eyebrow at Dinu, then exited the android and frame-jacked. A quick scan of recent BobNet blogs reassured me on that front. Returning to normal time, and to the android, I responded, There's nothing but general descriptions, Dinu. With all the crap happening, Bill's just been transmitting plans directly to other Bobs. A bit of serendipity there. I didn't add that I'd just sent off a description of this situation to Bill. Hopefully, he would scan the blogs for any other potentially damaging information and remove it. Great. We'd just reinvented military secrecy. Gina, who had continued monitoring the situation, announced, Anthor, Kaol, and Batarth are fending off missiles. It looks like whoever is still fighting has decided to go for a scorched earth policy. They're not even trying to board, just trying to knock the cities out of the sky. She looked over at me. I nodded. Reluctant as I was to get directly involved, in this case, hundreds of lives were at stake. I ordered several squads of busters down from their hiding place on Pelias, the inner moon. It'll take a few minutes for them to get there, I said to Gina. Can you tell the cities that help is coming? Gina nodded and typed furiously for a few moments. Done. This is unbelievable. Dinu shook his head. They're just trying to kill people. It's war, Dinu, Gina replied. It's not what we wanted, but apparently it's what the Council finds preferable to losing. Although I don't think they expected it to go this far either. Most of their recent moves look more like ad-libs than strategies. She looked at me. 3 Council members still outstanding. This could be orders from any or all of them. My money's on Brennan, though. Cal glanced at each of us. Some of the others at least seemed to be misguided but well-intentioned. He was all about the power. Maybe. Let's get this done, then we can worry about assigning blame. I looked up as my heads-up display showed the busters coming up on the fields of battle. I ordered them to take out the attackers, if possible, by taking out critical systems, but otherwise by whatever worked. In seconds, the reports came back. 4 ships downed by clean reactor strikes, 3 more totally destroyed. The 2 remaining ships turned tail and fled. I took a moment to mourn the people I'd just killed. Very probably they were just following orders. But those orders had meant knocking a city containing several hundred civilians out of the sky. There was a point where following orders didn't cut it. I put a couple of cloaked drones on the tail of the escaping ships and recalled my surviving busters. If there had been any doubt in the Council's teeny minds that the cursed replicant was still extant, this engagement had removed it. The Council forces would be moving much more cautiously in the future. Tell the city defenders not to shoot down the surviving ships, I said to Gina. They might lead us back to the leadership. Gina nodded, and we settled back onto the grass. It was an odd juxtaposition. Revolutionary leaders in the middle of a shooting war, directing operations, while lounging on a manicured lawn. I tracked the fleeing ships to a relatively small mat in the northern current, earmarked as an automated farming platform. Video images from the drones showed it to be anything but. A small but well-stocked airbase was probably the home of the Council fleet.
Well, that's not good.
Cal shook his head.
We'll have to check absolutely every mat on inventory now.
I grinned at him. Seems the Council has been planning this for a long time.
Or at least, planning for something,
he replied.
I can't see how they could have predicted your flying cities.
I nodded at that. This doesn't really look military, though. Security forces, maybe. Let's send in the roamers and a mop-up squad. Cal nodded. He and Gina started typing furiously while I worked on loading up the roamer squad into cargo drones. It took longer than expected to prepare for our assault. I was surprised to discover that with all the buzzing around and knocking out enemy ships and missiles, I was down to the dregs with busters and roamers. And without the system printers under my command, I couldn't immediately print more. In the end, Gina rounded up a squad of security people and we stormed the defenders the old-fashioned way. Sort of. I was still far happier with sacrificing an AMI than a human. Gina led the charge herself. The busters couldn't smash the buildings at speed. I didn't want to kill anyone. But they could smack gun emplacements hard enough to force defenders back. Concentrate on all defenders on the west walls, Gina's voice ordered over the comm system. Our security people set up a blistering fire which kept the defenders down. Marcus, there's a weak spot on the wall at the southwest side. Can you get an explosive into there? No explosives, Gina. Still too dangerous to print, but a weak spot was easy to target. A shipbuster came in at about 100 clicks and rammed the corner of the wall. 500 kilograms of steel completely did a number on it. Maybe a little too well. As usual, I seemed to be a little more enthusiastic with the ramming than was really required. Thanks, Captain Crash. All units enter with caution. I sent in some roamers as well, although all I had left were the little guys. The video feed showed a stunned, dust-covered group with no fight left in them. I think they're done, Gina. It's all mop-up. Gina, normally a somewhat dour, brooding person, was grinning unabashedly. We got Brennan. No question that he ordered the attacks. We'll be debriefing the security people we captured, but I'll bet none of the other council members were involved in this.
Still, they'll all have to be dealt with. There will be trials. There will likely be convictions. Then there will be the question of what to do with them.
Cal shrugged.
My money's on menial labor.
Gina blew out a noisy breath.
Yeah, let's not count our chickens just yet. We don't know if there are any more loci of resistance. We may get individuals who keep fighting back, but hopefully we can contain the damage from that. As long as there are no more council members in the wind, though, I think that's it for anything organized.
The biggest thing will be accounting for all the remaining council members, then. Cal looked at me. Sorry, buddy, I don't have any special tricks for finding individuals on an entire planet. I gave him a crooked smile. Or off-planet, which is also a possibility.
Oi.
Cal rubbed the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers.
This really came down to the wire. If we'd had to fight just one more battle, we probably would have run out of assets. Do you have the printers back?
I nodded. And I've already started replacement construction, but it'll be a few days before anything pops out the other end. If we do find ourselves another fight, I looked pointedly at Gina, we'd probably better go for containment rather than a punch-up. Cal nodded.
Meanwhile, we also have a whole society to put back together. I hope you guys are okay with overtime.
We all grinned back at him. 32. Found. Bill, September 22-27, Epsilon Eridani. I stared at the readings, frankly disbelieving. I glanced over at Garfield. His wide eyes and slack jaw said it all. We'd slapped together a quick prototype based on the power core scans from the alien Hulk. A small prototype. According to our measurements, this kludged-together rig was outperforming our fusion reactors 5-1. Well, this explains a lot, Garfield finally said. Of course, we're not just going to rip out all our reactors and replace them with this stuff. Well, no, Garfield grinned at me. But a pilot project? At that moment, Will popped in. Hey guys, what's this I hear about some others cargo vessels? I motioned Will to a chair and materialized some images. The two Bobs who volunteered to survey the Delta Pavonis system chanced upon a couple of cargo vessels that had been taken out during the defensive engagement. They must have drifted right through the system. The others didn't pick up on it, and the derelicts would have just continued out into the cosmos if those two hadn't found them. Will leaned forward and poked at one of the images. I think I remember that one, actually. It was almost cut in half. I nodded. That unit is being broken down for materials. The guys are repairing the hole in the other one, and they've had the bright idea, genius actually, of putting mover plates around it instead of trying to figure out the other's drive system. Then they'll fly it back to Earth. You could put 14 million people in that thing easily. Will's voice was hushed. I laughed. You could misplace 14 million people in that thing. I made a show of feeling around in my pockets. Dang it, where did I put those colonists? Will grinned back at me. Holy crap on a cracker. 1,500 ships or 1,500 trips, or one gigantic cargo carrier. 33. Project. Herschel, October 22-27, Delta Pavonis. Be careful what you wish for. Uh-huh. I was visiting Neil while we took a break. He draped himself across his chair sideways and was doing a good imitation of a boneless corpse. I could remember sitting like that when Original Bob was a teenager. Neil had a couple of behaviors that seemed to harken back to Bob's adolescence. Friggin' hell, he finally moaned. Can we go back to being pond scum? Life was so much easier. I laughed and signaled Jeeves for a beer. Neil had a template for a particularly good ale, and I tried to make a point of having one when I was visiting. I sat down, took a drink, then called up the project plan. Will, we're a little ahead of schedule, buddy. You could afford to take a few milliseconds off. Oh, ha, you are too funny. Neil straightened up. Well, at least we finally finished cutting up Hulk 2. Loading it all into Hulk 1's cargo bays is routine enough to be left to the AMIs. But building the mover plates... Yeah, I know. We weren't really anticipating having to deploy our printers when we came out here. It's a pain. We grinned at each other and said in unison, but it's a good pain. Anyway, I continued, Mood is in a half hour. You might want to get organized. Neil scowled at me, then pulled up his files. He muttered something about slavery, but got to work. The moot was crowded, but that was normal these days. There had been a problem with despondency for a few months after the loss of Delta Pavonis 4, but we'd bounced back. Now the Bobs were more determined than ever to deal out some payback. Neil and I picked a spot close to the podium. Normally we'd be at the back, as befitted pond scum, but we were now project leaders. Of course, we were also project workers, project gophers, and project janitorial staff, but who's counting? We would be expected to give a status report on the derelicts project. Bill mounted the podium, held the air horn above his head, and gave the traditional blat. The audience greeted him with the usual catcalls and boos. I stayed silent and noticed that Neil was more reticent than usual as well. It was much harder to be an agitator when we were standing up front. Bill looked around the audience, waiting for the commentary to die down. When he had quiet, he began to speak. I'm going to start off with a bombshell. Starting 20 days ago, a number of our monitoring drones around GL-877 were attacked. Per their standing instructions, they self-destructed immediately. In the last 2 instances, the drones weren't attacked, but chased. This news was met with gasps from the audience. Neil and I stared at each other, bug-eyed with shock, and he mouthed, "They know." Bill waited a moment for the chatter to die down. We figure the Delta Pavonis harvesting expedition reported back to the others' homeworld, and they correctly concluded that they were under surveillance. Based on the attempt to capture the last 2 drones, They may have surmised that we have a technological advantage of some kind. A hologram of the GL-877 system popped up in the air, showing the location of the surveillance drones around the system. Bill made a gesture with his hand, and one by one, drones were replaced by small explosion graphics. We're reconfiguring, but as we lose drones, our coverage will get spotty. We're biasing them toward the near side of GL-877 to catch any expeditions coming our way. We're also introducing some randomness in their positions, just to make it more difficult for the others to find the drones. There haven't been any new attacks in the last week, so that may be working. And Mario will be replacing the drones on a priority basis, but will still be deficient for a few years. Neil edged up to me. Something smells. What? There's something about this scenario that bothers me. Why'd they stop? Because they realized they couldn't catch the drones? Because we randomized the locations? Nope, not sufficient. Neil opened his mouth to add something, but at that moment, Bill decided to introduce us. Now, you've all been hearing about the derelict project. Herschel and Neil are here today to give you their first official update. Bill gestured toward us. I could feel myself blushing furiously as we mounted the podium. I looked around at the sea of Bobs, and my voice locked up. Neil, familiar with my stage fright, picked up smoothly. On a recon flight, we found a couple of others' cargo vessels drifting out of the Delta Pavonis system. One was pretty much totaled, but the other was almost intact, with damage limited to AI and drive systems. We were able to reactivate the power core. There's a separate report on what we've been able to figure out about the technology. Neil turned to me and gestured. He'd given me just the right amount of time to get it together. I picked up the thread smoothly. We've broken down the totaled derelict and have been using the materials to do repairs on the Bellerophon. The assembled Bobs picked up on our chosen name, and we received whistles and whoops of approval. When the approbation died down, I continued. Rather than trying to rebuild the drive, we're just manufacturing mover plates. Bill figures 24 will be enough to fly the whole thing to Earth. We've loaded the extra material from the other derelict into the hold, and we'll be manufacturing stasis pods during the voyage. I looked around for Riker, but couldn't see him, so I looked at Bill. We're thinking that if Earth would shift some manufacturing capacity into stasis pods, we could move a lot of people in one shot. I glanced around at the crowd. 4 or 5 dozen versions of my face looked back at me. Smiles, nods, frowns of concentration predominated. Okay, not so bad. Bobs were not subtle. If our presentation had been less than interesting, we'd know it. Questions? Bill said. Bedlam erupted. Okay, really not bad. Neil leaned closer to me. Isn't it nice to be important? I'm having second thoughts, thanks. Bill pointed to someone and the chaos quieted. Thor stepped forward. How confident are you of the alien power core? I opened my mouth to reply, but Neil jumped in. It works fine, just as dependable as one of our own and a lot more powerful. I glared at him and whispered, You lie like a log. Shut up, you. How many pods do you think you can make? Thor continued. We have enough material to build a pod for every human being alive, Neil answered. Just not enough time. In the 3.6 years subjective trip time, we figure we can make just over 5 million of them. Bill turned and spoke to someone. Will, how many could you put together at your end? Riker stepped forward. No more than a couple of million. We're working in non-relativistic time, but on the other hand, we don't have piles of refined materials just sitting there. We have to salvage every kilogram of metal, and the pickings are getting thinner. It's starting to slow colony ship production, as a matter of fact. The conversation descended into comparisons of critical paths, differing ramp-up strategies, result domains, and other, even less interesting things. I eyed Neil, and he nodded. As casually as possible, we sidled away from the debate and toward the bar. No one noticed our departure. I leaned against a rail with a beer in my hand and grinned at Neil. We're important. Yeah, when they notice we're gone, I'll concede. Meanwhile, he raised his beer in a toast. Gotta love moots. 34. Kidnapping. Bob, September 22-24, Delta Eridani, Eden. I was sitting in the sun with Buster, watching him casually work a piece of flint, when the Deltan came running up. He bent over, gasping for breath for a few moments, then straightened.
Archimedes has been grabbed. I think it was some guys from Caerleon. Must have been.
I leaped to my feet and almost yelled at the runner. Have you told Donald? Anyone else? He nodded, still gasping.
Yeah, Donald's gathering some hunters.
I looked over to see Buster silently gathering his bow and arrows. He didn't say anything, didn't look at me or the runner. His fur was flat, his inner turmoil telegraphed by his ears, which were curled in rage. Someone was going to die today. We hurried over to the hunter's tree where a group was forming. Donald waved at me as I came up.
Well, Robert, it looks like you and Archimedes might have been right. There's only one reason for them to grab him.
I shook my head. 2 reasons, actually. If Fred is involved, he may also be trying to get a reaction from me. I'm pretty sure I hurt his feelings last time we met. I glanced at Buster, standing beside me. If Fred's involved, today is his final day of life, I think. Buster stared straight ahead, still not looking at anyone. I'd set spy drones to searching for any large, fast-moving parties of Deltans. Reports were now starting to come in. I checked the heads-up. It showed 2 different groups, but only one was on a determined beeline for Caerleon. My bet would be on that one. I instructed the drones to try for close-ups and gave them Archimedes' profile to identify. Then I turned to Donald. Chances are they're on the east trail or will be soon. We can cut straight through the deep copse to catch up. I hoped Donald wouldn't question me. I knew for a fact that was true, but I couldn't explain how without blowing my cover. Fortunately, Donald took my word for it and started giving orders. In moments, we were running toward the deep copse, a thick grove of especially tall, old trees. Paradoxically, because of the thickness of the trees, there was very little underbrush to slow us down. We made it through in minutes. I held up my hand to stop the group and made a show of listening, then gestured up the trail. We took off at a sprint. It took less than a minute to catch up to the Caerleon group, who I knew had been having a problem with their captive grabbing every tree and branch he could reach. From my position, it looked like they'd solved the problem by beating Archimedes unconscious and then carrying him. A low growl escaped my throat, and I hoisted my spear. The Caerleon party, hearing our approach, stopped and formed a defensive semicircle, spears pointing outwards. Fred stepped forward, grinning his usual smug, nasty grin.
Hello, Robert. Robert's lackeys. I suggest you accept the inevitable. Your friend is going to be...
Fred looked down at the arrow protruding from his chest. With a surprised expression, he fell to his knees, then collapsed sideways to the ground. I turned to look at Buster. Dibs, he said with a shrug. Unfortunately, although I could understand and sympathize with Buster's actions, the Caerleon gang might retaliate by harming Archimedes. I would not allow that, even if it meant revealing that the Bob was still watching. I called up a squad of busters and sent them to the nearby trees, standing by. If at all possible, though, we would take these guys out the old-fashioned way. The Caerleons were still going through surprise at the quick death, but a few heads had started to turn toward their prisoner. With a roar of anger, I charged the spear line. My friends followed, yelling battle cries. I would easily be the first to reach the defenders, but how to handle it? I could, of course, take a couple of spear wounds without slowing my android form, but running around with spears sticking out of me would be hard to explain. On the other hand, I didn't want any of my friends to take a spear. I had less than 10 meters to decide on a plan. Instead of slowing down, I accelerated. As I came almost to the flint tips of their spears, I threw myself down and sideways. Half sliding, half rolling, I passed under the spear points before the Deltans could react. My tumbling body took out 3 of the front defenders and knocked down a couple behind them. With the sudden hole in the defensive line, the Caerleons were unable to hold off the attackers. The defenders tried to swivel to close the gap, but left themselves open to attack from the side. I heard growls and the smack of colliding bodies, as well as the more cringeworthy cries of people being impaled. I couldn't worry about it at the moment, though. A couple of the Caerleons seemed to have had exactly the thought I'd been concerned about. As I'd feared, they drew their flint blades and turned to Archimedes' limp form. I grabbed a spear that had been dropped and thrust it at the first enemy. At the last moment, I redirected the spear to what I hoped was a non-fatal attack. The spear passed through Delton muscle and jabbed the Delton behind him. I released the spear, leaving both Deltons howling with pain and surprise, grabbed the knife that one had just dropped, and drove it into the thigh of a third enemy. With the quick removal of 3 of their numbers, the others backed away from Archimedes, fear written on their faces. I pulled my lips back as far as I could and did my best Hulk impression, roaring and gnashing my teeth. Apparently it was effective. One tripped while trying to backpedal and sat down abruptly, and the other 2 turned tail and fled. I stood over Archimedes' still form and spun around, snarling, looking for anyone within reach. At this point, if I had caught someone, I very probably would have done something impossible for a Delton and blown my cover. Not necessary, though. The battle was over. 3 of ours were down, 8 of theirs were down. 3 of them obviously dead, including Fred. Buster and I exchanged silent looks. Then we turned to Archimedes. I knelt and examined him. He was still breathing, although a faint liquid sound in his lungs concerned me. The beating looked to have been more enthusiastic than really necessary. Deltons had marvelous healing abilities. I hoped it would be enough. Otherwise, Archimedes might lose an eye. The teeth, at least, would grow back. Very slowly and carefully, Buster and I lifted Archimedes and headed back to the village. A week later, Archimedes was looking much better. He hadn't lost the eye, although he was still complaining about blurry vision. He sat with his granddaughter, Lisa, who went into fits of giggles watching her grandfather eating baby food. He'd be on that diet for a few more weeks, according to Belinda. Donald sat in front of the fire, nursing a large hunk of jerky. He extended an arm, holding a knife out to me. I took the flint blade and examined it. Yeah, not exactly up to Archimedes' standards.
It's crap,
Donald said.
It looks like you guys were right. We questioned a couple of the survivors after the medicine woman was done with them. By the way, she thinks you're an idiot for wasting resources healing enemies.
I waved the comment away. Once the fight is over, everyone bleeds the same color. And Annie is way more reasonable than Cruella ever was. She would have just told me to stuff it. Donald nodded.
Anyway, the knife is some of the best work coming out of Caerleon. So they have crap knives and crap spears, and are barely doing better with hunting than how my father says things were back at the old village. They've even started to get gorilloids sniffing around again.
And they blame us. Donald grinned at me.
I never said it made sense. I guess it's our fault for having more skilled people and better tools and better hunting.
And more adults, I grinned back. Then I grew serious. But if this is the problem, it's fixable. Just have some of their best and brightest come over and get Archimedes to train them.
I'm sure they've thought of it,
Buster cut in as he came up and sat down.
But there's been so much fighting. They probably think we'd just laugh at them.
And they don't want to look weak.
I rubbed the fur above my eyebrow, the Delton equivalent of pinching the bridge of my nose. Unbelievable. So, how do we broach the subject? Archimedes looked up from playing with Lisa.
We should just offer to teach a couple of their people.
The teaching thing didn't work so well before, I pointed out.
They weren't hungry before,
Archimedes answered.
I bet they'll pay more attention now.
We looked at each other around the fire. No one had to put it into words. It was worth a try. 35. Cities victorious. Marcus, October 2215, Poseidon. A month after the uprising, things were finally settling down, but despite all my attempts to dodge, bob, and weave, and otherwise avoid taking on a position of responsibility, I'd still somehow ended up as the chairman pro tem. Of course, there was some logic to having the reins held by someone who was available 24/7, never forgot anything, and couldn't be bought or blackmailed. Still, I was going to arrange elections as soon as possible. The drone settled into New Thark's docking bay and floated into a parking spot. The cargo bay doors opened and I stepped out. I took a moment to look around. Most of the spots were taken as people continued to move into the city. I walked to the elevators at the end of the bay and got in with a half-dozen random strangers. Interestingly, 200 years later and 20 light years away, people still behaved the same in elevators as they did in original Bob's day. Everyone turned to face the doors and ignored each other. As the elevator rose to ground level, I surreptitiously examined the other passengers. No one paid me any particular attention. I was just another anonymous, random individual. It amazed me how good that felt. I stepped out of the elevator and found myself outdoors, with a transport station to my left and a park to my right. I let the other passengers hurry to grab taxis first, while I took the time to look around. This was my first time in the new version 3 floating city. This model boasted 2 square kilometers of usable surface divided about evenly between residences, businesses, and parkland. The Fibrex dome stretched over the city, ensuring a warm, dry environment no matter the weather outside. Residents were scattered around, sitting on benches or on the grass, working away on their tablets or remote controlling some piece of equipment, VR headset and gloves firmly in place. Why the council would have wanted to prevent this was beyond me. Some people just seemed to want to display their power by defining what others could or couldn't do. I shook my head, then turned and headed for the transport station. I grabbed the next available pod, spoke Cal's address, and sat back as the pod accelerated into the underground track. In less than 2 minutes, I exited the pod, followed the directions it had given me, and was standing at Cal's front door. We sat around the table, Cal, Dinu, Gina, Vinny, and myself, drinking beer and comparing war stories. The new government of Poseidon, such as it was. Gina put up a list of names.
Here's the council members we've captured. 5 out of 7. Based on comments from a couple of them, you might be right about the last 2 having escaped in subs.
So they might be hiding out on any of 100 mats. I smiled at her. Or they might already be in the belly of the Leviathan. Gina shrugged.
Yeah, no way to know. But they're not like royalty. They won't command a following of fanatically loyal subjects.
Right. We'll keep an eye out, do patrols, but it's not top of the priority list. What are you doing with the 5 you captured?
4 of them will go to trial for the 150 deaths of Thark citizens. The consensus seems to be a lifetime posting to the fish plant or something equally smelly.
And Brennan? Gina sighed.
Honestly, Marcus, we don't really have anything. We played with the idea of incarcerating him for life, or deporting him to another colony, or even back to Earth. All of those alternatives are a ton of effort and cost, and make no sense, except as some form of retribution, and he's not worth it. We're considering just sticking him with the other 4 and being done with it.
There were nods around the table. Fish plant labor was easy to automate, but the council had used it as a punishment for dissidents and miscreants. The irony of hoisting them on their own petard was so overt that it needed no further words. Brennan deserved worse, but I agreed that he didn't deserve the effort required to arrange something. And meanwhile, I looked to one of my monitor windows in my heads-up, which showed the orbital auto-factories in full swing. Another dozen or so cities, and we'll have the entire population of Poseidon in the air. Gina grinned at me.
And then we're going to vote you out on your ear.
Can't wait. 36. Announcement. Riker, October 22-27, Seoul. Bedlam. No, even that wasn't a strong enough word. It reminded me of the first meetings of the UN way back when. Everyone was attempting to talk at once. Half the people were hammering their request buttons, the other half were ignoring them. The chairperson sat at her desk with her head in her hand. I grinned into the camera. Technically, I still had the floor, so my mic was active. So, want to hear more? the chaos cut off like a switch had been thrown. As I said, this vessel will hold all of the remaining population of Earth. Every last one. We will obviously still have to build stasis pods. However, Herschel and Neil, the two Bobs in charge of the Bellerophon, are also building pods in their cargo bay as they travel. Good news, they have all the materials they could possibly need. Bad news, with relativistic time dilation, they'll only have 3.5 years to work with. Representative Misra requested and got the floor.
Could they slow slightly and enjoy a longer subjective time to work in?
I smiled and nodded. Ms. Misra understood the mechanics very well. It made talking to her so much easier than most of these bozos. I grimaced for a moment at the unintended contempt in that thought. That's correct. However, it would result in a longer transit time from our point of view. There's still the others to worry about. Their plans are a big unknown, but we're going to assume we don't have time for a leisurely flight plan. I'd rather get them here quickly than we can make use of all that scrap in their hold. I shared out a list of tasks and milestones. Most of the UN delegates ignored it, but a few looked down and started reading. Once the Bellerophon gets here with her hull full of scrap metal, we can assign every single printer and AMI to the task of building more pods. Meanwhile, we need to make sure our shuttles are all in good working order. I've calculated that we can move about 300,000 people at a time using the existing airworthy Enclave shuttles and cargo vessels. I'd like to get that number up to around 1 million. I released the floor and nodded to the chairperson. Every request light in the UN lit up. Fun times. Representative Hubert from the North African Enclave took the floor.
Mr. Johansson, I am concerned that we will not have enough stasis pods for all of Earth when the ship, the Bellerophon, arrives. Yet I note that you are still allocating resources to things like colony ships and shuttles. What about creating more printers to increase the throughput? I'm not trying to tell you how to do your job, but have you considered what the most efficient schedule is?
Hubert sat down and turned off his mic, giving up the floor. I nodded an acknowledgement. I could have been offended, but I'd rather have the question asked and answered. Representative Hubert, it is a good question and well worth asking. And the answer is that I spend a considerable portion of my time considering all the alternatives. The problem is that no matter what course you navigate, there is always a bottleneck. Whether it's lack of printers to build everything, or lack of sufficient material, or lack of drones and roamers to assemble the parts into the end product, it's always something. Shift your schedule and you simply shift the nature of the bottleneck. Printers, for instance, are the most complex thing that a printer can make, except for something biological. They take forever and have a high defect rate because of the precision required. So it's not as simple as just making more printers to enjoy the benefits of exponential growth. You give up considerable manufacturing opportunity while engaged in that particular task. I paused and looked around at the various windows. Concentrate on shuttles and we may not have enough stasis pods come arrival day. Concentrate on stasis pods and we may not have a way to get people up to the carrier quickly enough. I've already decided to stop manufacturing colony ships. We've got enough returning ships now to keep a flow going, and we need the raw materials for shuttles and pods. I paused again, then turned off my mic and sat down. Immediately, a dozen request lights lit up. With a sigh, I realized I would be here for a while. 37. Court Battle. Howard, September 2220, Omicron Squared, Eridne.
How long do you expect this to last?
I whispered to Ms. Benning. I glanced across the courtroom where Bridget's children sat with their lawyer, Gus Kistler.
Actually, it'll be over in an hour,
Benning replied.
In the end, it's a really cut-and-dry situation. Bridget Broger's last will is on file, and its veracity is not being questioned. They are trying for an undue influence ruling, but since that's usually about inheritances, it's not likely to fly. Lastly, they're trying for sympathy with the laying our mother to rest gambit.
She shuffled some papers.
What it's really about is a delaying action. They've been trying to prevent it for long enough that something tit 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 for long enough that something tit